Okay, guys. I had to stop the video there for a second and wanted to just go back and just finish this concept up, and we'll finish up with hurricanes in this video, and then move on to tornadoes. So remember, the whole storm in this case is rotating counterclockwise, and because the storm is moving in this particular example diagonally to the northwest at a rate of 50 kilometers per hour, and here on the left side of the storm, the wind speeds are moving in opposite directions. The storm is moving one way. Because of the counterclockwise rotation, the wind is moving the opposite direction the storm is moving. So we have a net or total wind speed on the left side of the storm of 125 kilometers per hour, whereas on the right side of the storm, the rotational wind is moving with the storm instead of against it like it was on the left side of the storm. So now the speed of the storm is combined with the wind speed on the right. And now the essential total wind speed, the net wind speed on the right side of the storm, is 225 kilometers per hour. So if a hurricane were to make landfall in your area, it would be much worse to be on the right side of the storm compared to the left side of the storm. The left side of the storm you would experience less wind and less damage, less storm surge. The right side of the storm, you're going to have much more impact. In fact, there's usually more tornadoes. If there's going to be tornadoes in a hurricane, they usually happen in the right side of the storm, the upper right side, where the wind speeds are highest. So anyway, that's something that most people don't think about, this combined wind effect. Okay, moving on. Hurricanes happen in a season. There's a seasonality to hurricanes. And actually, something that was very unusual this winter was that we had hurricanes at a time of the year where we almost never see them. And that was probably due to the strong El Nino that we experienced. But hurricane season typically kicks off June 1st and goes to about November 30th. These purple areas here show the common locations that we find hurricanes around the world. And we can see we've got hurricanes off the east coast of the United States. We also have hurricanes off the west coast in Mexico and the Americas down there. We have to have warm ocean water to form a hurricane. So we're not going to get hurricanes in the winter. Usually, this winter was an exception. We typically get our hurricanes forming and the water has had a chance to heat up. Remember, water has a high specific heat, and it takes a while. So even though we may have our highest air temperatures July, August, hurricane season is usually really at its peak in August, September, maybe even October. But anywhere from June 1st to November 30th, when the temperatures are warm, is considered hurricane season. And even though it might be cold by November 30th, remember the water takes a long time to cool down. So the water is still warm even at November 30th. So these are the usual cutoffs for what's considered to be hurricane season. Again, we have our hurricanes happening near the equator, but not on the equator. You can even see this gap here. The equator must be right in there because we don't have a Coriolis effect. So we have hurricanes happening above and below the equator. Now, if we take a look at the typical hurricane track for the United States, it might look something like this. It's kind of strange. So let's say the storm officially becomes a hurricane at this green dot, probably a Category 1, which means that it was probably a tropical depression and tropical storm somewhere out here, but that's not recorded. It's a hurricane at this point, and what we often see in the United States is that the hurricanes move towards the west. They often hit the Caribbean, here's the Bahamas, and then they go into the Gulf of Mexico, and then they hook back around and swing back out east. That's kind of strange, but that's the typical pattern, or a pattern that we see a lot in America. In fact, if we look at a lot of hurricanes, here are many of the hurricane tracks. And each line represents a different storm, a different hurricane. And we can see that at first glance it might look kind of like spaghetti, but we've kind of got this pattern where they tend to kind of go towards the United States and then curve back out to sea much of the time. Or if they don't curve back out to sea, they curve back out over land. And sometimes what we see is they'll hit a Gulf state like Mississippi or Alabama, but then they curve back in and go across land for a while. Once a hurricane hits land, it loses strength very quickly. It loses its warm ocean water, which is sort of like its fuel source, and it also encounters a lot of friction with the land. The ocean is relatively flat. There's waves, but overall it's flat, especially when compared to land. Over land, we have mountains, we have hills, we have valleys, we have buildings, cities. All of these things break up the hurricanes, and most importantly, they're away from their warm ocean water. So you're never going to see a hurricane in like the Dakotas or somewhere like Iowa. They're always going to be along the coast. But what's interesting is that we almost never get hurricanes affect California, Washington, Oregon. And if we go back to the previous slide, or 2 slides ago, it looks like they should. We've got a very active hurricane scene happening in the Caribbean, the Gulf, and the Atlantic. And even though we have hurricanes happening over here on the West Coast, they very rarely impact Mexico and the United States and the Americas. It happens occasionally, but not often. The reason for that has to do with global wind patterns. And what essentially happens on the eastern side of the country is when a hurricane forms, it usually forms somewhere off the coast of Africa. Starts out as a tropical depression, gets upgraded to a tropical storm, and then eventually to a hurricane. And it gets caught up in the trade winds, and the trade winds will blow it towards the Gulf, towards the Carolinas, places like Georgia, places like Florida. But once it moves over 30 degrees, then it gets caught up in a different wind pattern, and the prevailing westerlies take over, the winds that blow storms across our country from the west to the east. And that's what causes that kind of hook that we see in the hurricane tracks. So down here, the trade winds, and these winds are not at the surface. They're high up in the atmosphere, like at the altitude where airplanes fly, like big jetliners fly. They're blowing the hurricanes. These prevailing, or these trade winds are blowing the hurricanes towards the United States, towards the East Coast, towards the Gulf, towards Florida, towards the Carolinas. But once you get above 30 degrees, here's the 30-degree line of latitude, we can see that the storms start curving back as they get caught up in the prevailing westerlies. Remember, the prevailing westerlies actually blow east. They're called westerlies because the wind comes from the west. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Now, on the west coast, we very rarely see them make landfall because of these prevailing wind patterns. They typically blow the storm. Let me pause. Okay, there we go. Had a little trouble with the mouse there. But on the west coast, the winds, the prevailing winds in the high altitude, blow the hurricanes away from the coast. There's also another reason too. We typically have cooler water on the west coast than we do on the east coast. That's another story. But the wind patterns are not going to blow the hurricanes onto the land. You can see these arrows blow them out into the Pacific. So there's often lots of hurricanes off the coast of California, but they almost never make landfall, and we don't really hear about them in the news very much because they really don't impact us much. They don't hit land. They might affect shipping and fishing, but otherwise they don't really cause much of a problem most of the time. But the Atlantic hurricane season is the one everybody watches because this is the one that really blows the storms into our country and the island nations like Jamaica and the Bahamas, Bermuda, places like that. So that's a overview of hurricanes. Now we'll shift over to tornadoes.